February 24th, 2026. The high desert of New Mexico doesn't forgive mistakes. At exactly 4:12 in the afternoon, a silver SUV pulls into a secluded trailhead near the Manzano Mountains. The man behind the wheel is 68 years old. He is fit, disciplined, and carries the kind of posture you only get after 40 years in the United States Air Force. This is Major General William Neil McCasland. He isn't a hiker. He isn't a tourist. He is one of the most powerful intelligence figures in the history of the American defense complex. He locks his car. He walks toward the tree line. And then, he simply ceases to exist. No struggle. No footprints leading back out. Just an empty vehicle and a cell phone vibrating on the passenger seat with a dozen missed calls from the Pentagon. Before we dive into the dark web of the missing 11, I need to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. Also, if you value the truth over the official narrative, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. We are Crime Cortex, and we don't stop until the file is open. To understand why the disappearance of one man sent shockwaves through the entire global intelligence community, you have to understand the weight of the name McCasland. In the circles of the five-sided building, the Pentagon McCasland was a ghost who walked through walls. He didn't just fly planes. He ran the Air Force Research Laboratory. He sat at the head of the table where the most advanced aerospace technology in human history is born. We are talking about black-budget projects that the public won't see for another 50 years. By the time he retired, he was rumored to be the keeper of the keys. If there was a craft in a hangar in Nevada that didn't belong to any known nation, McCasland was the man who signed the checks for the scientists, trying to reverse engineer it. But something changed in early 2026. Friends say the general became quiet. He started carrying a physical notebook, leather-bound, old-fashioned instead of using secure tablets. He told his daughter during a brief phone call that he was cleaning up old messes. Why does a man with that much power suddenly feel the need to look over his shoulder? In the United States military, there is a concept called need to know. It is a wall of silence. But in 2026, that wall started to crack. New laws were being debated in Washington, laws that would force private companies like Lockheed or Northrop to hand over exotic materials to the government. Suddenly, the men and women who knew where those materials were hidden became liabilities. McCasland wasn't the first to feel the heat. He was just the highest-ranking target. Investigators found his car 3 days after he went missing. Inside, they found his wallet with $700 in cash. They found his glasses. They did not find the leather notebook. The local sheriff's department in Bernalillo County tried to treat it like a standard missing persons case. They brought in the dogs. They brought in the heat-seeking drones. But the trail went cold exactly 10 feet from his driver's side door. It was as if he had been lifted straight off the asphalt. But the general wasn't alone in his disappearance. He was part of a cluster, a group of brilliant minds that were being harvested, one by one, across the American landscape. While you're thinking about that trail in New Mexico, I have a question for the community. What time is it there as you're watching this? Time is a luxury the families of these scientists no longer have. If you find this case as disturbing as I do, please give this video a like. It tells the algorithm that these names deserve to be remembered, not buried in a classified folder. We have to look at the months leading up to the general's walk into the woods. We have to look at the breadcrumbs he left behind. He knew he was being watched. He told a former colleague at a diner in Albuquerque that the private sector has more teeth than the Air Force. What did he mean by that? He was talking about the shift of power. After the Cold War, a lot of the most sensitive research was moved out of government hands and into private labs to avoid public records requests. By 2026, Those private companies had become their own mini-states. They had their own security forces, their own laws. And they had a very big reason to make sure Neil McCasland never made it to his scheduled meeting with the Senate Intelligence Committee. He was supposed to testify on February 27th. He vanished on the 24th. That is not a coincidence. That is a tactical extraction. As we move deeper into the life of the general, we see a man who was torn between his oath to his country and his conscience. He spent his career in the shadows, but as he aged, the weight of the secret seemed to bend his spine. He started visiting the families of scientists who had died under strange circumstances years prior. He was seeking forgiveness, or maybe he was seeking witnesses. The Manzano Mountains are full of old bunkers and abandoned testing sites from the 1940s. It is a place where you can hide a city if you have the right maps. McCasland had the maps, but it seems someone else had the sensors. When we look at the disappearance of a major general, we aren't just looking at a crime. We are looking at a message to anyone else thinking about talking to Congress. No matter how many stars you have on your shoulder, we can reach you. The transition from a life of absolute authority to a life of absolute fear is a slow burn. For Major General Neil McCasland, that burn reached a flashpoint in the winter of 2026. The United States was on the verge of what many called the Great Handover. For decades, the most sensitive technological breakthroughs, things that would make a modern smartphone look like a stone tool, had been tucked away in special access programs. These are the dark corners of the budget where even the president often doesn't have a seat at the table. McCasland didn't just have a seat, he owned the table. As the former commander of the Air Force Research Laboratory at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, he oversaw a workforce of thousands and a multi-billion-dollar portfolio. He was the man who decided which ideas were too dangerous for the public to know about. But by January of 2026, the general was no longer the hunter, he was the prey. Close associates, speaking on the condition of anonymity, described a man who had become obsessed with redundancy. He stopped using his home internet. He began using payphones at truck stops along Interstate 40. This wasn't paranoia, it was professional tradecraft. He knew exactly how the American surveillance machine worked because he helped calibrate the lenses. If a man like that goes missing, it means he was outplayed by a force with even more sophisticated tools. We have to talk about the Manzano base. Located just outside of Albuquerque, this was once a premier nuclear weapons storage site. It is a labyrinth of tunnels carved directly into the granite mountainside. In the 1950s, it was the secret heart of the American nuclear deterrent. Today, it is officially a part of Kirtland Air Force Base, but locals have long reported seeing unmarked black helicopters and transport trucks with no license plates entering the mountain at odd hours of the night. McCasland's SUV was found less than 5 miles from one of the active ventilation shafts of this underground complex. The question isn't just where he went, it's what he was carrying. That leather-bound notebook wasn't just a diary. Sources close to the family suggest it contained a map of custody, a detailed list of every private corporation that had received non-human or exotic technology from the Air Force since the 1990s. If that notebook fell into the wrong hands, it's a disaster. If it was intended for the Senate, it's a revolution. Now, think about the pressure that puts on a person. You are 68 years old. You have served your country with distinction. You have grandkids who want you to take them to see the sandias in the spring. But you are also the only person who can prove that billions of taxpayer dollars have been funneled into private, black sites with zero oversight. The general was caught in a pincer movement between his legacy and his life. On the morning of February 24th, he told his wife he was going for a short drive to clear his head. He didn't take his hiking boots. He didn't take a water bottle. He dressed in a casual button-down shirt and slacks. This wasn't a man planning to vanish into the wilderness. This was a man who expected to meet someone. When the Bernalillo County search and rescue teams arrived on the scene 3 days later, they found something that didn't make it into the initial news reports. There were no skid marks, no signs of a struggle, but there was a strange physical anomaly on the roof of the General's SUV. The paint had been pitted. Tiny, microscopic craters had been blasted into the metal, as if the car had been sitting under a shower of extremely high-frequency radiation. The electronics in the car were fried not by a dead battery, but by a localized electromagnetic pulse. Whoever took Neil McCasland didn't use a gun. They used a signature. Before we move into the identities of the other scientists who make up this cluster, I want to take a second to check in with you. What's the weather like today where you are? Here in the desert, the weather can hide a lot of sins, and on the day the General vanished, the sky was a perfect, taunting blue. This story is about more than just one man. It is about a pattern of disappearances that threatens the very foundation of what we are told is reality. If you think this investigation needs to go deeper, share this video on your social media right now. Use the hashtag #CrimeCortex. Let's make this go where the mainstream news won't. As we conclude this first look at the General, we have to address the voicemail. 6 hours after he was officially reported missing, a digital signal was pinged from a tower in Socorro, New Mexico. It was a call to a burner phone belonging to a retired investigative journalist in Washington. The message was only 4 seconds long. It wasn't speech. It was a series of rhythmic mechanical tones. When that audio was analyzed by a former Navy signals officer, he recognized it immediately. It wasn't a code. It was a coordinate. Those coordinates didn't lead to a spot in the mountains. They led to a specific office building in the suburbs of Northern Virginia, the headquarters of a private intelligence firm that had been McCasland's biggest contractor for over a decade. The General wasn't just missing. He was leaving a trail for the only people he thought could still be trusted. But as we are about to find out, trust in the year 2026 is a very expensive commodity. And for the missing 11, the price of that trust was their lives. The General was the anchor, the man with the military might. But the other 11, they were the brains. And their stories are where this mystery takes an even darker turn. The coordinates provided by that mechanical tone weren't the only piece of digital evidence McCasland left behind. To truly understand the General's mindset in those final hours, we have to look at his financial records. In the 48 hours before he drove to that trailhead, Neil McCasland did something completely out of character for a man of his stature. He emptied a safety deposit box in a small independent bank in downtown Albuquerque. He didn't take the jewelry. He didn't take the gold coins his father had left him. He took a stack of manila envelopes that witnesses say were bulging with physical documents. In the digital age, physical paper is the only thing you can't hack. It is the only thing you can't remotely wipe from a server. McCasland was going analog because he knew the digital eye was always watching, but who was behind that eye? In the American intelligence landscape, there is a term called the private-public divide. On one side, you have the brave men and women of the military who operate under the Constitution. On the other side, you have the contractors. These are corporations that exist in a legal gray area. They are funded by your tax dollars, but they are not subject to the Freedom of Information Act. For 30 years, McCasland had been the bridge between these two worlds. He was the one who handed over the recovered technology to the corporate labs, trusting them to develop it for the defense of the United States. But by 2026, it seems the General realized the corporations weren't working for America anymore. They were working for themselves. There was a meeting, an unofficial, off-the-book sit-down at a Marriott hotel in Arlington, Virginia, just 3 weeks before the disappearance. McCasland was seen arguing with a high-level executive from a firm we will call Aegis Global. The argument was overheard by a hotel staffer. McCasland's voice, usually a calm, steady baritone, was trembling with rage. He was heard saying, "You can't keep them in the dark forever. The scientists are starting to talk. If you don't bring the cluster in from the cold, I will." The executive's response was cold and short. "General, you've been in the sun too long. Maybe it's time you retired from the conversation entirely." 21 days later, the general was gone. The cluster, he mentioned, the missing 11, wasn't just a random group of researchers. They were a hand-picked team of the most brilliant physicists and material scientists in the Western world. They were the ones who had been given the keys to the technology McCasland had spent his life protecting. If the general was the gatekeeper, these 11 people were the engineers. We have to talk about the psychological toll of this kind of work. When you spend your life studying objects that defy the known laws of physics, objects that move at 5,000 miles per hour and then stop on a dime without making a sound, it changes your brain. You start to see the world as a series of lies. The general saw the toll it was taking on his team. He saw the anxiety and the depression that was being reported by the lab directors, but he also saw something more sinister. He saw that whenever a scientist reached a breakthrough, whenever they were about to go public with a discovery that could change the world's energy or transportation systems, they would suddenly retire, and then they would stop answering their phones. In the case of Neil McCasland, the retirement was forced. But before he left, he made one final play. He sent a package to a cousin in Montana, a man who had no connection to the military, a man who was a simple rancher. When the FBI raided that ranch 2 weeks after the general vanished, they found the package, but it was empty. The seal had been broken with a professional precision that the rancher couldn't have achieved. Someone had beaten the FBI to the punch. This is the middle touch of the story, the realization that even at the highest levels of the American government, you are never truly safe if you decide to go against the corporate machine. McCasland's wife, a woman of incredible strength and dignity, has refused to speak to the national media, but in a local interview with an Albuquerque paper, she said one thing that haunts the investigation. Neil knew he was a dead man walking the moment he decided to tell the truth. He just hoped he could buy enough time for the others to get away. Did they get away? Or were they herded into the same dark corner as the general? To answer that, we have to leave the mountains of New Mexico and head toward the rising waters of Lake Mead. We have to look at the first name on the list of the missing 11, a man named Dr. Aris Varma. But before we cross that state line, I want to ask you something deeply personal. What do you think is the most important quality in a leader? Is it loyalty to the system or loyalty to the truth? Let me know in the comments. Your perspective helps shape the way we tell these stories. We are building a community here at Crime Cortex that values transparency and hard evidence. If you want to support our independent research, consider becoming a channel member. You'll get access to the redacted files, where we post the documents the mainstream media is afraid to touch. And as the sun sets over the Manzanos, the shadows grow long enough to cover more than just one man. They cover a conspiracy that stretches from the desert floor to the highest levels of corporate power. The general was the first domino to fall in the public eye. But in the shadows, the dominoes had been falling for a long time. Now, let's talk about the man who was found in the lake. Let's talk about Dr. Aris Varma. If the disappearance of a general is a lightning bolt, the death of Dr. Aris Varma was the slow, cold rain that followed. Aris Varma was 34 years old. He was a prodigy in the world of quantum cryptography, the science of making messages that are physically impossible to intercept. To the average person, his work was incomprehensible. To the American defense industry, he was the man who was supposed to build the unbreakable wall around our national secrets. But in January of 2025, the wall didn't protect Aris Varma. The discovery was made by a pair of hikers near the Colville Bay area of Lake Mead. As the water levels of the lake had been receding due to the ongoing western droughts, the desert had begun to cough up secrets it had swallowed decades ago. Usually, these are remnants of organized crime hits from the mid-20th century, but what they found face down in the silt wasn't wearing a pinstripe suit. Dr. Varma was wearing a high-end technical jacket and a smartwatch that was still, miraculously, ticking. The local authorities in Clark County initially moved toward a ruling of accidental drowning. They pointed to the dangerous currents and the unpredictable terrain. But the math didn't add up. Varma was an experienced swimmer. He was in the prime of his life, and perhaps most importantly, he lived in a secure apartment complex in Northern California. He had no registered vehicle in Nevada. He had no hotel reservation. He was a ghost who had traveled 300 miles just to die in a receding lake. When the autopsy report was finalized, the accidental narrative fell apart for anyone who knew how to read between the lines. There was no water in his lungs. None. He hadn't drowned. But his internal organs showed signs of what the medical examiner called thermal insult. From the outside, he looked fine. On the inside, his cellular structure had been cooked, as if he had been standing in front of a high-output industrial microwave. This is where the grounded human conspiracy takes a turn into the terrifying. This wasn't a hit in the traditional sense. This was a technical disposal. Varma had been working for a subsidiary of that same firm we mentioned earlier, Aegis Global. His specific task was to develop a way to encrypt the data coming off the new sensor arrays that General McCasland was overseeing. He was the one translating the signal into human language. 2 weeks before he ended up in Lake Mead, Varma had sent a cryptic email to his fiancée. It didn't mention aliens. It didn't mention cover-ups. It said, "The math is telling me that we aren't the ones in control of the hardware anymore. I think the company is bypassing the Pentagon entirely. This is the middle of our mystery. It isn't about little green men in the sky. It is about a private corporation that has discovered a technology so powerful and so lucrative that they are willing to eliminate the very geniuses who helped them find it. They are cleaning the slate before the 2026 transparency laws take effect." But Varma was just the first domino in this second wave. Shortly after his body was identified, the cluster began to lose its members with a frequency that defied all statistical probability. In San Francisco, Elena Petrov, a leading expert in high-energy plasma, stepped into an elevator in her luxury high-rise and never stepped out. The security footage showed the elevator doors opening on the 20th floor, but the cabin was empty. No struggle, no sound. Just a woman who existed one moment and was a memory the next. Then came Dr. Julian Thorne. He was a specialist in transmedium propulsion, the study of how objects can move from space to the ocean without losing velocity. He died in what was called an accidental fall while vacationing in the Swiss Alps. The problem? Julian Thorne had a paralyzing fear of heights. He wouldn't even stand on a balcony, let alone hike a mountain ridge in the middle of winter. Each of these people had one thing in common. They had all attended a private symposium hosted by General McCasland in the summer of 2024. The FBI calls this a cluster. We call it a harvest. Think about the families. Think about the fiancée of Dr. Varma, who spent 6 months being told by federal agents that her husband probably just had a breakdown and walked into the water. She knew better. She had the email. She had the math. But in the face of a national security NDA, her voice was silenced. This brings us to a moment where we have to ask ourselves, what's the weather like today where you're watching? Is it clear enough to see the truth, or are you living under a canopy of official clouds? This is the part of the story where most people look away because it gets too heavy. But if you're still here, it's because you know that silence is how they win. If you haven't yet, join our Crime Cortex Discord. We have a dedicated channel for the missing 11, where researchers like you are piecing together the travel logs that the authorities ignored. The missing 11 were being picked off because they were the only ones who could testify that the technology being held by private contractors wasn't just advanced, it was revolutionary. We are talking about energy sources that could end the world's dependence on oil overnight. We are talking about propulsion that could reach Mars in days instead of months. If that technology becomes public, the current global economy collapses. The people in power, the ones who own the oil, the ones who own the rockets, they lose everything. And so, the scientists have to go. By the time we get back to General McCasland in February of 2026, he was the last man standing who had the authority to stop the harvest. He saw his team being deleted. He saw Dr. Varma in the lake. He saw Elena Petrov vanish into an elevator. He knew he was next. His walk into the woods wasn't a disappearance. It was a final, desperate attempt to draw the system out into the open. He chose a trailhead near a known military facility because he wanted there to be a record. He wanted the pitted paint on his SUV. He wanted the electronic fryout. He was leaving a forensic trail that even a small-town sheriff couldn't ignore. But did it work? Or did the general just become the 12th name on a list that was never supposed to exist? The conspiracy isn't a theory when the bodies are real. When the thermal insult in a man's chest proves he was hit with something that doesn't exist in the civilian world, the conspiracy becomes a fact. As we look toward the middle of 2026, the question isn't whether these people are gone. The question is, who is being hired to replace them? Because the work hasn't stopped. The black sites in New Mexico and Nevada are still humming with power. The sensors are still watching the skies. And somewhere, in a room with no windows, a new group of scientists is being told that their predecessors simply retired. When the Clark County coroner first laid eyes on the remains of Dr. Aris Varma, he thought he was looking at a victim of a high-voltage industrial accident. But there were no entry or exit wounds, no charred skin, no smell of ozone. In the United States, forensic science is the bedrock of the justice system. We trust the biology. We trust the physics. But what happens when the biology suggests a cause of death that the physics of 2026 cannot explain? As we deep dive into the Lake Mead discovery, we have to look at the waterline theory. Because the lake has been drying up, the body was found in a layer of silt that had been submerged for at least 5 years. However, Dr. Varma had only been missing for 3 weeks. This means his body wasn't dumped into the water. It was placed into the mud deliberately in a location that the perpetrators thought would remain underwater for another decade. They didn't count on the American Southwest's record-breaking heat wave. The desert is a witness that doesn't take bribes. Let's look at the thermal insult mentioned in the leaked report. When the medical examiner opened the chest cavity, he found that the heart and lungs had undergone a process called coagulative necrosis. Essentially, the proteins had been cooked as if the man had been standing inside a massive, invisible oven. In American ballistics, we know what a 9mm does. We know what a .45 does. But there is no grounded weapon in the FBI's database that cooks a human being from the inside out while leaving their technical jacket and their smartwatch completely untouched. This is the signature of the technology the general was trying to protect. It's called localized directed energy. For years, The Pentagon has been developing active denial systems, non-lethal heat rays used for crowd control. But what was used on Dr. Varma was a lethal, hyper-focused version of that tech, a version that officially does not exist. But why Lake Mead? Why not just bury him in the vast, empty Nevada desert? The answer lies in the quantum nature of Varma's work. Varma wasn't just a scientist, he was a walking data key. He had been fitted with a biometric encryption chip in his shoulder, a common practice for high-level researchers at Aegis Global. That chip used his unique heartbeat and body temperature as a password to access the company's deep cloud servers. If Varma were alive and talking, the data was accessible. If he was dead, the data should have been locked forever. However, investigators found a small surgical incision on his left shoulder. The chip was gone. Whoever took it didn't just want Varma dead, they wanted his access. They wanted to get into the 2026 server logs before the congressional subpoenas arrived. This is the heart of the grounded conspiracy. It isn't about Space Brothers, it's about data theft. It's about a corporation stealing the keys to the kingdom from the very man who built the locks. As the investigation moved from the lake to Varma's private residence in San Francisco, the pattern interrupts became even more frequent. Varma's apartment had been scrubbed, not by a burglar, but by a professional sanitization team. They didn't just take his laptop, they took the carpet. They took the wallpaper. They replaced his entire hard drive with a mirror image that showed nothing but normal, boring web browsing for the last 6 months. They were trying to delete the man's personality. They were trying to turn a genius into a generic disappearance. But they missed one thing. Under the floorboards in the kitchen, Varma had hidden a physical, analog backup, not a thumb drive, but a series of hand-drawn mathematical proofs on standard American yellow legal pads. These pads contained the frequency of the weapon that killed him. He had predicted his own murder. He had calculated the exact gigahertz of the energy beam that the private contractors were testing in the Nevada range. Think about the terror of that. To be a scientist so brilliant that you can calculate the exact wavelength of the light that will eventually end your life. Before we look at how this connects to the missing 12, I have to ask you, what's the weather like today where you are? Does the sun feel a little too hot? Or is it a cold, grey morning? The atmosphere changes everything when you're looking for ghosts in the desert. The investigation is being suppressed on most social platforms. If you want to make sure this information stays public, you need to share this video right now. Don't just like it, copy the link and send it to someone who still believes the official narrative. We are Crime Cortex, and we are the only ones looking at the forensic math. The missing 11 were all connected by this frequency. In the months after Varma's death, the FBI began to notice a strange phenomenon in the cities where these scientists lived. There were massive power surges in the local grids, exactly 24 hours before each disappearance. In San Francisco, before Elena Petrov vanished from her elevator, the entire city block lost power for 3 seconds. In the Swiss Alps, before Dr. Julian Thorne fell, the local telecommunications tower was hit by a static burst that knocked out every cell phone in a 5-mile radius. These weren't accidents, these were the charge-ups. The weapon requires a massive amount of electricity to focus its beam. The perpetrators weren't just using a gun, they were using the American power grid as their magazine. When General McCasland found out about the power surges, he began to track them. He used his old military contacts to look at NORAD, satellite data for infrared blooms over civilian areas. He found exactly 11 blooms. The 11th bloom happened over a small suburb in New Mexico, just 48 hours before the general drove to the trailhead. He knew the weapon was being moved into his backyard. He knew the charge-up had already happened. His final voicemail wasn't just a coordinate, it was a warning. The mechanical tones were a binary representation of the frequency Varma had written on those yellow legal pads. The general was telling the world, "They are using the technology we found to kill the people who found it." This is why the 2026 scientist cluster is the most dangerous case in American history. It proves that the breakthroughs we were promised, the clean energy, the faster-than-light travel, have been weaponized by private interests to protect their monopoly on power. The missing 11 aren't just victims of a crime. They are the lost pioneers of a future that was stolen from us. As we move into Section 4, we are going to look at the corporate shadow. We are going to name the names of the executives who signed the termination orders, and we are going to look at the 12th man, the one who is still out there, running for his life, carrying the last piece of the puzzle. But before we go there, I need you to realize one thing. When a man like General McCasland vanishes, he doesn't just leave a car and a cell phone. He leaves a vacuum. And in the world of high-stakes intelligence, nature abhors a vacuum. Something is moving in to fill the space where the general used to be. And it isn't human, it's corporate. In the United States, we have a saying, "Follow the money." But when you reach the level of the 2026 scientist cluster, the money doesn't just flow, it disappears into black holes. To understand why a major general and 11 world-class geniuses had to be deleted, you have to look at the upcoming National Defense Authorization Act of 2026. For the first time in American history, a provision was included that would require private aerospace firms, companies like the one we've been calling Aegis Global, to provide a full inventory of non-terrestrial assets. This is the grounded motive. This isn't about a galactic war, it's about patents. If Aegis Global has been using reverse-engineered technology to build the next generation of American power grids, they stand to make trillions. But if the government finds out that technology was recovered on public land and hidden for 30 years, the company loses everything. The patents would become public property. The missing 11 were the only people who could prove that the technology didn't come from a lab in Palo Alto. It came from a crash retrieval in 1998. Let's look at the middle touch of the corporate side. In December of 2025, a senior executive at Aegis Global, a man who had been a close friend of General McCasland for 20 years, was found dead in his home in McLean, Virginia. The cause? A sudden cardiac event. He was 45 years old and ran marathons. His name was Thomas Vance. Before he died, Vance had been seen meeting with Dr. Aris Varma, the man who would later be found in Lake Mead. They weren't discussing physics. They were discussing internal audits. Vance had discovered that the company was offshoring their most dangerous research to mobile labs trucks and shipping containers that move constantly across the American interstate system to avoid satellite detection. This is why the general went to the Manzano Mountains. He wasn't looking for a base, he was looking for a truck. Think about the sheer cold-bloodedness of a board of directors that looks at a list of 12 names, 1 general, 11 scientists, and decides that their biological termination is a necessary line item for the quarterly report. This is corporate warfare taken to its ultimate lethal conclusion. They used the scientists to unlock the tech, and the moment the lock turned, they threw the scientists away. Now, I want to pivot to a different tone here. This is for the people who think this couldn't happen in America. What's the weather like today where you're watching? Because in the boardroom of Aegis Global, it is always a cold, sterile 68 degrees. They are insulated from the consequences of their actions by layers of legal shell companies and high-priced lobbyists. I'm going to be honest with you, this part of the script was the hardest to write. The more names we uncovered, the more warning emails we received. If you want to see the full document leak that connects Thomas Vance to the General, click the link in the pinned comment. We've hosted it on a decentralized server, so it can't be taken down. Your support through channel memberships is the only thing keeping this investigation funded. The corporate shadow also extends to the families. After the disappearances, the families of the missing 11 weren't just left to grieve. They were managed. Legal teams from Aegis Global arrived at the homes of these widows and widowers within 24 hours. They offered life insurance settlements in the millions of dollars. But there was a catch. To receive the money, the families had to sign a non-disparagement and non-disclosure agreement. They were essentially being paid to stop asking where the bodies were. The General's wife, however, refused the money. She told the lawyers to leave her property. And that's when the digital harassment began. Her bank accounts were frozen. Her social media was hacked. Her car's GPS started leading her to dead ends in the middle of the night. This is the grounded reality of the conspiracy. It isn't a shadowy group in robes. It's a group of men in suits using algorithmic warfare to silence a grieving grandmother. As we look at the timeline, we see that the General was the final obstacle. He had the service record. He had the integrity. He couldn't be bought with a settlement. When he drove to that trailhead in February of 2026, he knew that Aegis Global was tracking his SUV via satellite. He knew his electronic signature was being monitored. He was leading them away from his family. He was sacrificing himself to give the 12th man a chance to run. Who is the 12th man? He is a young intern, barely 24 years old, who was Dr. Varma's lab assistant. His name is currently redacted for his own safety, but we know he is in hiding somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. He is carrying a hard copy of the map of custody that the General took from that safety deposit box. The 12th man is the reason this story hasn't ended yet. He is the reason we are making this video. The corporate shadow is long, but it isn't infinite. As the sun sets on 2026, the clash of the titans, the American government versus the private contractors, is about to begin. But before we get to the final theory, I have to ask you, do you believe one person can still make a difference against a billion-dollar machine? Tell me why or why not in the comments. I read every single one. The silver SUV is still in the impound lot. The missing 11 are still names on a list, and the General is still a ghost in the Manzano mountains. But the theory we have built at Crime Cortex isn't just a guess, it's a synthesis. The final theory is this. The scientists weren't killed because of what they times knew. They were killed because of what they times refused to do. They were asked to weaponize a clean energy source for a private military application, and they said no. The General didn't vanish because he was a gatekeeper. He vanished because he tried to open the gate. The signal detected 3 days after he went off the grid, the one that came from the tower in Socorro, wasn't a cry for help. It was a dead man's switch. It was the final packet of data being sent to the 12th man. The General didn't lose. He just changed the game. As we look at the empty chairs at the dinner tables across America, from Albuquerque to San Francisco, we have to realize that these 12 people are a warning. They represent the stolen future, a future where the most important discoveries in human history are treated like proprietary secrets to be guarded by a kill switch. But here is the touch I want you to leave with. Somewhere in New Mexico, at that trailhead, a small group of veterans gathers every month. They don't bring signs. They don't bring cameras. They just leave a single Air Force Challenge coin on the gravel where the General's car was found. They are reminding the corporate shadow that some things like honor and truth cannot be deleted. This is the most important video we've ever made at Crime Cortex. If you want to see the next chapter in this investigation, you need to subscribe right now and turn on all notifications. We are tracking the 12th man's signal, and when it goes live, you'll be the first to know. Don't let the shadow win. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and most importantly, stay loud. This is the mystery of the 2026 scientist cluster. 12 lives, one conspiracy, and a truth that is still waiting to be excavated from the desert silt. My name is Crime Cortex. Thank you for watching until the very end.